Life cannot find reasons to sustain it, cannot be a source of decent mutual regard, unless each of us resolves to breathe such qualities into it. Chinoa, Conversations with Leto II. Hedley Tuek, High Priest of the Divided God, had grown increasingly angry with Styros. Although too old himself ever to hope for the High Priest's bench, Styros had sons, grandsons, and numerous nephews. Styros had transferred his personal ambitions to his family. A cynical man, Styros. He represented a powerful faction in the priesthood, the so-called scientific community, whose influence was insidious and pervasive. They veered dangerously close to heresy. Tuek reminded himself that more than one high priest had been lost in the desert. Regrettable accidents. Styros and his faction were capable of creating such an incident. It was afternoon in Keen, and Styros had just departed, obviously frustrated. Styros wanted Tuek to go into the desert and personally observe Shiana's next adventure there. Suspicious of the invitation, Tuek declined. A strange argument ensued, full of innuendo and vague references to Shiana's behavior, plus wordy attacks on the Bene Gesserit. Styros, obviously suspicious of the sisterhood, had taken an immediate dislike to the new commander of the Bene Gesserit keep on Arrakis. What was her name? Oh yes, Odrade. Odd name, but then the sisters often took odd names. That was their privilege. God himself had never spoken against the basic goodness of the Bene Gesserit. Against individual sisters, yes, but the sisterhood itself had shared God's holy vision. Tuek did not like the way Styros spoke of Shiana. Cynical. Tuek had finally silenced Styros with pronouncements delivered here in the Sanctus with its high altar and images of the divided God. Prismatic beam relays cast thin wedges of brilliance through drifting incense from burning melange onto the double line of tall pillars that led up to the altar. Tuek knew his words went directly to God from this setting. God works through our latter-day Siona, Tuek had told Styros, noting the confusion on the old counselor's face. Shiana is the living reminder of Siona, that human instrument who translated him into his present divisions. Styros raged, saying things he would not dare repeat before the full council. He presumed too much on his long association with Tuek. I tell you, she is sitting here surrounded by adults, intent upon justifying themselves to her and to God. Tuek could not let such words pass. Leaning close to the high priest, Styros grated, She is at the center of an educational system geared to anything her imagination demands. We deny her nothing. Nor should we. It was as though Tuek had not spoken. Styros said, Kenya has provided her with recordings from Baras Dalat. I am the Book of Fate, Tuek intoned, quoting God's own words from the horde at Baras Dalat. Exactly, and she listens to every word. Why does this disturb you? Tuek asked in his calmest tone. We don't test her knowledge. She tests ours. God must want it so. No mistaking the bitter anger on Styros' face. Tuek observed this and waited while the old counselor marshaled new arguments. Resources for such arguments were, of course, enormous. Tuek did not deny this. It was the interpretations that mattered, which was why a high priest must be the final interpreter. Despite, or perhaps because of, their way of viewing history, the priesthood knew a great deal of how God had come to reside on Arrakis. They had Dar es Balat itself and all its contents, the earliest known no chamber in the universe. For millennia, while Shai-Hulud translated the verdant planis of Arrakis into desert Rakis, Dar es Balat waited under the sands. From that holy horde, the priesthood possessed God's own voice, his printed words, and even holophotos. Everything was explained, and they knew that the desert surface of Rakis reproduced the original form of the planet, the way it looked in the beginning, when it was the only known source of the holy spice. She asks about God's family, Styros said. Why should she have to ask about...
She tests us. Do we give them their proper places? The Reverend Mother Jessica, to her son, Moad'Dib, to his son, Leto II, the Holy Triumvirate of Heaven.
Leto III, Styros muttered. What of the other Leto, who died at Sardaukar hands? What of him?
Careful, Styros,
Tuek intoned.
You know my great-grandfather pronounced upon that question from his very bench. Our divided God was reincarnated with part of him remaining in heaven to mediate the ascendancy. That part of him became nameless then, as the true essence of God should always be.
Oh? Tuek heard the terrible cynicism in the old man's voice. Styros's words seemed to tremble in the incense-laden air, inviting terrible retribution. Then why does she ask how our Leto was transformed into the divided God? Styros demanded. Did Styros question the holy metamorphosis? Tuek was aghast. He said,
In time, she will enlighten us.
Our feeble explanations must fill her with dismay, Styros sneered.
You go too far, Styros.
Indeed, you do not think it enlightening that she asks how the sand trout encapsulate most of Rakis's water and recreate the desert? Tuek tried to conceal his growing anger. Styros did represent a powerful faction in the priesthood, but his tone and his words raised questions that had been answered by high priests long ago. The metamorphosis of Leto II had given birth to uncounted sand trout, each carrying a bit of himself. Sand trout to divided God. The sequence was known and worshipped. To question this denied God. You sit here and do nothing, Styros accused. We are pawns of...
Enough!
Tuek had heard all he wanted to hear of this old man's cynicism. Drawing his dignity around him, Tuek spoke the words of God.
Your Lord knows very well what is in your heart. Your soul suffices this day as a reckoner against you. I need no witnesses. You do not listen to your soul, but instead to your anger and your rage.
Styros retired in frustration. After considerable thought, Tuek enrobed himself in his most suitable finery of white, gold, and purple. He went to visit Shiana. Shiana was in the roof garden atop the central priestly complex, there with Kanya and two others, a young priest named Baldik, who was in Tuek's private service, and an acolyte priestess named Kipuna, who behaved too much like a reverend mother for Tuek's liking. The sisterhood had its spies here, of course, but Tuek did not like to be aware of it. Kipuna had taken over much of Shiana's physical training, and there had grown a rapport between child and acolyte priestess that aroused Kanya's jealousy. Even Kanya, however, could not stand in the way of Shiana's commands. The four of them stood aside a stone bench, almost in the shadow of a ventilator tower. Kipuna held Shiana's right hand, manipulating the child's fingers. Shiana was growing tall, Tuek noted. 6 years she had been his charge. He could see the first beginnings of breasts poking out of her robe. There was not a breath of wind on the rooftop, and the air felt heavy in Tuek's lungs. Tuek glanced around the garden to assure himself that his security arrangements were not being ignored. One never knew from what quarter danger might appear. 4 of Tuek's own personal guards, well armed but concealing it, shared the rooftop at a distance, one at each corner. The parapet enclosing the garden was a high one, just the guards' heads standing above the rim. The only building higher than this priestly tower was Keen's primary wind trap, about 1,000 meters to the west. Despite the visible evidence that his security orders were being carried out, Tuek sensed danger. Was God warning him? Tuek still felt disturbed by Styros' cynicism. Was it wrong to allow Styros that much latitude? Shiana saw Tuek approaching and stopped the odd finger-giving exercises she was performing at Capuna's instructions. Giving every appearance of knowledgeable patience, the child stood silently with her gaze fixed upon the high priest, forcing her companions to turn and watch her. Shiana did not find Tuek a fearsome figure. She rather liked the old man, although some of his questions were so bumbling, and his answers. Quite by accident, she had discovered the question that most disturbed Tuek. Why? Some of the attendant priests interpreted her question aloud as, "Why do you believe this?" Shiana immediately picked up on this, and thereafter, her probings of Tuek and the others took the unvarying form, "Why do you believe this?" Tuek stopped about 2 paces from Shiana and bowed.
"Good afternoon, Shiana."
He twisted his neck nervously against the collar of his robe. The sun felt hot on his shoulders, and he wondered why the child chose to be out here so often. Shiana maintained her probing stare at Tuek. She knew this gaze disturbed him. Tuek cleared his throat. When Shiana looked at him that way, he always wondered, is it God looking at me through her eyes? Kanya spoke. Shiana has been asking today about the fish speakers. In his most unctuous tones, Tuek said,
God's own holy army.
"All of them women?" Shiana asked. She spoke as though she could not believe it. To those at the base of Rakian society, fish speakers were a name from ancient history, people cast out in the famine times. She is testing me, Tuek thought. Fish speakers, the modern carriers of the name, had only a small trading spying delegations on Rakis, composed of both men and women. Their ancient origins no longer were significant to their current activities, mostly working as an arm of Ix.
Men always served the fish speakers in an advisory capacity,
Tuek said. He watched carefully to see how Shiana would respond. Then there were always the Duncan Idahos, Kania said.
Ah, yes, of course. The Duncans.
Tuek tried not to scowl. That woman was always interrupting. Tuek did not like being reminded of this aspect to God's historical presence on Rakis. The recurrent Gola and his position in the Holy Army carried overtones of Bene Tlailac's indulgence. There was no avoiding the fact that fish speakers had guarded the Duncans from harm, acting, of course, at the behest of God. The Duncans were holy, no doubt of it, but in a special category. By God's own account, he had killed some of the Duncans himself, obviously translating them immediately into heaven. Capuna has been telling me about the Bene Gesserit, Shiana said. How the child's mind darted around. Tuek cleared his throat, recognizing his own ambivalent attitude towards the Reverend Mothers. Reverence was demanded for those who were beloved of God, such as the saintly Chenua, and the first high priest had constructed a logical account of how the holy Hui Nori, bride of God, had been a secret Reverend Mother. Honoring these special circumstances, the priesthood felt an irritating responsibility towards the Bene Gesserit, which was carried out chiefly by selling melange to the sisterhood at a price ridiculously below that charged by the Tlailaksu. In her most ingenious tones, Shiana said, Tell me about the Bene Gesserit, Headley. Tuek glanced sharply at the adults around Shiana, trying to catch a smile on their faces. He did not know how to deal with Shiana calling him by his first name that way. In one sense, it was demeaning. In another sense, she honored him by such intimacy.
God tests me sorely, he thought.
Are the Reverend Mothers good people? Shiana asked. Tuek sighed. The records all confirmed that God harbored reservations about the sisterhood. God's words had been examined carefully and submitted finally to a high priest's interpretation. God did not let the sisterhood threaten his golden path. That much was clear.
Many of them are good,
Tuek said. Where is the nearest Reverend Mother? Shiana asked.
At the sisterhood's embassy here in Keen,
Tuek said. Do you know her?
There are many Reverend Mothers in the Bene Gesserit keep, he said.
What's a keep?
That's what they call their home here.
One Reverend Mother must be in charge. Do you know that one?
I knew her predecessor, Tamalane, but this one is new. She has only just arrived. Her name is Odrade.
That's a funny name.
Tuek's own thought, but he said, One of our historians tells me it is a form of the name Atreides.
Shiana reflected upon this. Atreides. That was the family that had brought Shaitan into being. Before the Atreides, there had been only the Fremen and Shai Hulud. The oral history, which her people preserved against all priestly prohibition, chanted the begats of the most important people on Arrakis. She heard these names many nights in her village.
Muad'Dib begat the tyrant begat Shaitan.
Shiana did not feel like arguing with Tuek. Anyway, he looked tired today. She said merely, Bring me to this Reverend Mother Odrade. Kipuna hid a gloating smile behind her hand. Tuek stepped back, aghast. How could he comply with such a demand? Even the Rakian priesthood did not command the Bene Gesserit. What if the sisterhood refused him? Could he offer a gift of melange in exchange? That might be a sign of weakness. The Reverend Mothers might bargain. No harder bargainers lived than the sisterhood's cold-eyed Reverend Mothers. This new one, this Odrade, looked to be one of the worst. All of these thoughts fled through Tuek's mind in an instant. Kanya intruded, giving Tuek the needed approach. Perhaps Kipuna could convey Shiana's invitation, Kanya said. Tuek darted a glance at the young acolyte priestess. Yes, many suspected, Kanya among them obviously, that Kipuna spied for the Bene Gesserit. Of course, everyone on Arrakis spied for someone. Tuek put on his most gracious smile as he nodded to Kipuna.
Do you know any of the Reverend Mothers, Kipuna?
Some of them are known to me, my Lord High Priest, Kipuna said.
At least she still shows the proper deference. Excellent, Tuek said. Would you be so kind as to start this gracious invitation from Shiana, moving up through the Sisterhood's embassy?
I will do my best, my Lord High Priest.
I'm sure you will.
Kipuna began a prideful turn towards Shiana, the knowledge of success growing within her. Shiana's request had been ridiculously easy to ignite, given the techniques provided by the Sisterhood. Kipuna smiled and opened her mouth to speak. A movement at the parapet about 40 meters behind Shiana caught Kipuna's attention. Something glinted in the sunlight there, something small and... With a strangled cry, Kipuna grabbed at Shiana, hurled her at the startled Tuek, and shouted, Run! With that, Kipuna dashed towards the swiftly advancing brightness, a tiny seeker trailing a long length of Shiga wire. In his younger days, Tuek had played bat-ball. He recognized Shiana instinctively, hesitated for an instant, and then recognized the danger. Whirling with the squirming, protesting girl in his arms, Tuek dashed through the open door of the stair tower. He He heard the door slam behind him and Kanya's rapid footsteps close against his heels. "What is it? What is it?" Shiana pounded her fists against Tuek's chest as she shouted.
"Hush, Shiana, hush!"
Tuek paused on the first landing. Both a chute and suspenser drop led from this landing into the building's core. Kanya stopped beside Tuek, her panting loud in the narrow space. "It killed Capuna and 2 of your guards," Kanya gasped. "Cut them up. I saw it. God preserve us." Tuek's mind was a maelstrom. Both the chute and the suspenser system were enclosed wormholes through the tower. They could be sabotaged. The attack on the roof might only be one element in a far more complex plot. "Put me down," Shiana insisted. "What's happening?" Tuek eased her to the floor, but kept one of her hands clutched in his hand. He bent over.
"Shiana, dear, someone is trying to harm us."
Shiana's mouth formed a silent "oh," and then, "They hurt Capuna?" Tuek looked up at the roof door. Was that an ornithopter he heard up there? Styros. Conspirators could take 3 vulnerable people into the desert so easily. Kanya had regained her breath. "I heard a thopter," she said. "Shouldn't we be getting far away from here?"
"We will go down by the stairs,"
Tuek said. "But the—"
"Do as I say."
Keeping a firm hold on Shiana's hand, Tuek led the way down to the next landing. In addition to the chute with suspenser access, this landing had a door into a wide curving hall. Only a few short steps behind the door lay the entrance to Shiana's quarters, once Tuek's own quarters. Again she hesitated. "Something's happening on the roof," Kanya whispered. Tuek looked down at the fearfully silent child beside him. Her hand felt sweaty. Yes, there was some sort of uproar on the roof. Shouts, the hiss of burners, much running about. The roof door, now out of sight above them, crashed open. This decided Tuek. He flung open the door into the hallway and dashed out into the arms of a tightly grouped wedge of black-robed women. With an empty sense of defeat, Tuek recognized the woman at the point of the wedge. Odrade. Someone plucked Shiana away from him and hustled her back into the press of robed figures. Before Tuek or Kanya could protest, hands were clapped over their mouths. Other hands pinioned them against a wall of the doorway. Some of the robed figures went through the doorway and up the stairs. "The child is safe, and that's what's important for the moment," Odrade whispered. She looked into Tuek's eyes. "Make no outcry." The hand was removed from his mouth. Using voice, she said, "Tell me about the roof." Tuek found himself complying without reservation.
"A seeker, towing a long Shiga wire. It came over the parapet. Capuna saw it and—"
"Where is Capuna?"
"Dead. Kanya saw it."
Tuek described Capuna's brave dash towards the threat. Capuna dead, Odrade thought. She concealed a fiercely angry sense of loss. What a waste. There must be admiration for such a brave death, but the loss. The sisterhood always needed such courage and devotion, but it also required the genetic wealth Capuna had represented. It was gone, taken by these stumbling fools. At a gesture from Odrade, the hand was removed from Kanya's mouth. "Tell me what you saw," Odrade said. "The seeker whipped the Shiga wire around Capuna's neck and—" Kanya shuddered. The dull thump of an explosion reverberated above them, and then silence. Odrade waved a hand. Robed women spread along the hallway, moving silently out of sight beyond the curve. Only Odrade and 2 others, both chill-eyed younger women with intense expressions, remained beside Tuek and Kanya. Shiana was nowhere to be seen. "The Ixians are in this somewhere," Odrade said. Tuek agreed. "That much Shiga wire." "Where have you taken the child?" he asked. "We are protecting her," Odrade said. "Be still." She tipped her head, listening. A robed woman sped back around the curve of the hallway and whispered something in Odrade's ear. Odrade produced a tight smile. "It is over," Odrade said. "We will go to Shiana." Shiana occupied a softly cushioned blue chair in the main room of her quarters. Black-robed women stood in a protective arc behind her. The child appeared to Tuek quite recovered from the shock of the attack and escape, but her eyes glittered with excitement and unasked questions. Shiana's attention was directed at something off to Tuek's right. He stopped and looked there, gasping at what he saw. A naked male body lay against the wall in an oddly crumpled position, the head twisted until the chin lay back over the left shoulder. Open eyes stared out with the emptiness of death. Styros. The shredded rags of Styros's robe, obviously torn from him violently, lay in an untidy heap near their body's feet. Tuek looked at Odrade. "He was in on it," she said. "There were face dancers with the Ixians." Tuek tried to swallow in a dry throat. Kanya shuffled past him towards the body. Tuek could not see her face, but Kanya's presence reminded him that there had been something between Styros and Kanya in their younger days. Tuek moved instinctively to place himself between Kanya and the seated child. Kanya stopped at the body and nudged it with a foot. She turned a gloating expression on Tuek. "I had to make sure he was really dead," she said. Odrade glanced at a companion. "Get rid of the body." She looked at Shiana. It was Odrade's first chance for a more careful study of the child since leading the assault force here to deal with the attack on the temple complex. Tuek spoke behind Odrade. "Reverend Mother, could you explain, please, what—" Odrade interrupted without turning. "Later." Shiana's expression quickened at Tuek's words. "I thought you were a Reverend Mother." Odrade merely nodded. What a fascinating child. Odrade experienced the sensations she felt while standing in front of the ancient painting in Terraza's quarters. Some of the fire that had gone into the work of art inspired Odrade now. Wild inspiration. That was the message from the mad Van Gogh. Chaos brought into magnificent order. Was that not part of the Sisterhood's coda? This child is my canvas, Odrade thought. She felt her hand tingle to the feeling of that ancient brush. Her nostrils flared to the smells of oils and pigments. "Leave me alone with Shiana," Odrade ordered. "Everybody out." Tuek started to protest, but stopped when one of Odrade's robed companions gripped his arm. Odrade glared at him. "The Bene Gesserit have served you before," she said. "This time we saved your life." The woman holding Tuek's arm tugged at him. "Answer his questions," Odrade said, "but do it somewhere else." Kanya took a step forward towards Shiana. "That child is my—" "Leave!" Odrade barked, all the powers of voice in the command. Kanya froze. "You almost lost her to a bumbling lot of conspirators," Odrade said, glaring at Kanya. "We will consider whether you get any further opportunity to associate with Shiana." Tears started in Kanya's eyes, but Odrade's condemnation could not be denied. Turning, Kanya fled with the others. Odrade returned her attention to the watchful child. "We've been waiting a long time for you," Odrade said. "We will not give these fools another opportunity to lose you."